Napoleon Bonaparte is remembered as a conqueror, a tyrant, a genius, a monster, a hero, often all at the same time. But before the crowns, before the cannons, before Europe burned under his ambition, Napoleon was something far more dangerous than a king. He was a nobody who refused to accept his place. Born on a remote Mediterranean island that had only just become French, Napoleon entered the world as an outsider. He spoke French with a thick Corsican accent that his classmates mocked. He came from minor nobility, rich in pride, poor in influence. In elite French schools, surrounded by the sons of powerful families, Napoleon learned early that brilliance alone was not enough. Power, he realized, belonged to those who seized it. This realization shaped everything that followed. Napoleon would grow up obsessed with history, mathematics, and war. He devoured books on Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, not as legends, but as case studies. He did not admire them for their glory. He studied them for their methods. From a young age, Napoleon was not asking how to live a good life, but how to dominate a chaotic world. And chaos, soon enough, would offer him an opening. The French Revolution shattered the old order of Europe. Kings lost their heads. Aristocracies collapsed. Institutions that had stood for centuries were suddenly fragile. To most people, the revolution meant terror and uncertainty. To Napoleon, it meant opportunity. He rose not because he was born powerful, but because he understood instability better than anyone else. One of the most surprising facts about Napoleon is how young he was when history began to bend around him. At just 24 years old, he was already a general, not through favoritism, but through results. On the battlefield, Napoleon saw patterns others missed. He moved faster, struck harder, and took risks that traditional commanders considered reckless. More often than not, those risks paid off. Napoleon believed that speed was a weapon. While other generals planned wars like chess matches, Napoleon treated them like storms. He attacked before enemies were ready, before alliances were complete, before decisions had been made. His armies marched farther, lived off the land, and fought with a level of coordination Europe had never seen before. Warfare was no longer slow and ceremonial. Under Napoleon, it became total, relentless, and modern. But Napoleon was not just a military innovator. He was also a master of image. Long before social media, Napoleon understood the power of narrative. He carefully controlled how victories were reported, how defeats were explained, and how he himself was portrayed. Bulletins from the front exaggerated enemy losses and minimized French casualties. Paintings depicted him calm and heroic, even in moments of chaos. Napoleon did not wait for history to judge him. He wrote his own legend in real time. Another lesser-known fact, Napoleon was not naturally charismatic in conversation. He was awkward, intense, often abrupt. Yet soldiers adored him, not because he was warm, but because he was present. Napoleon remembered names, noticed details, and rewarded merit regardless of background. In an age defined by rigid class divisions, this was revolutionary. Men believed that under Napoleon, talent mattered more than birth. That belief built loyalty stronger than fear. As his victories multiplied, so did his ambition. Napoleon no longer wanted to serve France. He wanted to reshape it. In 1799, he seized power in a coup, presenting himself not as a dictator, but as a savior, restoring order. The irony is striking. The revolution that destroyed monarchy would soon elevate a single man above them all. Yet Napoleon insisted he was different. He crowned himself emperor, but claimed to defend revolutionary ideals. He centralized power, but codified laws that still influence modern legal systems today. The Napoleonic Code guaranteed equality before the law, protected property rights, and dismantled feudal privileges. Even Napoleon's enemies would later admit that he was not merely a conqueror, he was a builder. This duality defines Napoleon more than any single battle. He spread freedom through conquest and tyranny through control. He abolished old hierarchies, then created new ones loyal only to him. He spoke of reason while unleashing unprecedented violence across Europe. Napoleon was not a contradiction by accident. He was a contradiction by design. Perhaps the most fascinating fact about Napoleon is that he never believed his rise was extraordinary. To him, greatness was not destiny. It was discipline. He slept little, worked obsessively, dictated letters at all hours, and managed details most rulers delegated. Napoleon believed that brilliance came from relentless effort, not inspiration. And yet, despite all his control, one truth haunted him. The same forces that lifted Napoleon up, war, ambition, speed, would eventually destroy him. But before the fall, before the exile, before the final silence on a distant island, Napoleon Bonaparte would become the most powerful man in Europe. He would defeat emperors, redraw borders, and force the world to adapt to him, not because he was born to rule, but because he refused to be ignored. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise cannot be understood without understanding his sense of alienation. He was French by law, Corsican by blood, and European by ambition. This tension shaped his worldview from childhood and fueled a quiet resentment that never left him. In school, he was mocked for his accent, his provincial manners, and his poverty compared to the sons of Parisian elites. Instead of adapting, Napoleon withdrew, and in that withdrawal, he sharpened his mind. One important fact, often overlooked, is that Napoleon was not a natural extrovert. He was introspective, intense, and prone to long silences. While others socialized, he studied. Mathematics became his refuge. History became his obsession. He learned early that emotion could be controlled, but knowledge could be weaponized. This is why artillery appealed to him more than cavalry. Artillery required calculation, timing, and precision, qualities Napoleon trusted more than charisma or brute force. At the French military academies, Napoleon absorbed Enlightenment ideas alongside classical military theory. He admired rational systems and despised waste. This mindset later translated into his battlefield strategies: concentrate force, strike decisively, and end wars quickly. Prolonged conflict, he believed, weakened states and corrupted societies. Ironically, his own wars would become the longest Europe had ever known. Another revealing fact is how early Napoleon developed contempt for indecision. He saw hesitation as the greatest enemy of leadership. This belief was reinforced during the early years of the French Revolution, when political factions paralyzed the government while enemies closed in on France from all sides. Napoleon concluded that strong, centralized authority was not only efficient, but necessary. This belief would later justify everything he did. Napoleon's first major opportunity came during the siege of Toulon in 1793. The city had rebelled against the revolutionary government and was supported by British forces. Napoleon, still young and relatively unknown, proposed a bold plan: seize the high ground controlling the harbor, rather than assaulting the city directly. The plan worked. Toulon fell. Britain retreated. France noticed. What made this moment crucial was not just the victory, but Napoleon's interpretation of it. He did not see success as luck. He saw it as proof that intellect could overpower tradition. Older generals had dismissed his ideas because they broke convention. Napoleon took that personally and remembered it. From that point forward, he trusted his own judgment above all else. His rapid promotion was both a reward and a risk. Napoleon rose faster than the political system could fully assess him. He learned to navigate revolutionary politics with the same precision he used on the battlefield. He pledged loyalty where necessary, avoided ideological extremes, and presented himself as a man of action in a world of talk. While others debated principles, Napoleon delivered results. This pragmatism made him indispensable and dangerous. A fascinating fact about Napoleon is his relationship with fear. He understood it deeply, but rarely felt it the way others did. Not because he was fearless, but because he believed fear could be mastered through preparation. He once remarked that imagination governs the world, meaning that perception often mattered more than reality. This is why he focused on morale as much as logistics. A confident army, he believed, could defeat a larger one. Napoleon's Italian campaign in 1796 cemented this philosophy. Leading an underfunded, poorly supplied army, he moved with astonishing speed. He separated enemy forces, defeated them individually, and forced peace treaties that reshaped the political map of Italy. Soldiers who had been starving suddenly found themselves victorious. They credited Napoleon not just with strategy, but with purpose. This campaign transformed him from a general into a legend. Yet even as his fame grew, Napoleon remained acutely aware of his precarious position. He had power, but not legitimacy. France was still a republic, and ambitious generals had a history of being discarded once they became inconvenient. Napoleon understood that military success alone was not enough. He needed public support, political influence, and control over his own narrative. This realization drove his next move, Egypt. The Egyptian expedition was, on the surface, a military gamble. Beneath that, it was something else entirely, a calculated attempt to rival Alexander the Great. Napoleon did not just bring soldiers. He brought scientists, scholars, and artists. He wanted to conquer territory, but also knowledge. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone during this campaign would later revolutionize understanding of ancient Egypt, even though Napoleon himself would not benefit from it. Militarily, Egypt was a mixed outcome. Napoleon won on land, but lost at sea. The destruction of the French fleet stranded him far from home. But once again, Napoleon controlled the story. He returned to France as a hero, leaving his army behind, and framed the expedition as a triumph of civilization rather than a strategic failure. This ability, to fail without appearing defeated, was one of Napoleon's greatest strengths. By the time he returned, France was exhausted by instability. The government was weak. Corruption was rampant. Napoleon saw the pattern clearly. Chaos creates hunger for order. In 1799, he acted. The coup that brought him to power was swift, calculated, and almost bloodless. Napoleon presented himself not as a tyrant, but as a restorer of the revolution's true ideals. In reality, he was positioning himself above them. Napoleon did not yet call himself emperor. He called himself first consul. The title sounded modest. The power was absolute. He centralized authority, reformed finances, stabilized the currency, and rebuilt institutions shattered by years of upheaval. For many French citizens, life became more predictable, more secure. They did not question the cost. Order, after all, felt like freedom. Napoleon's transformation was nearly complete. The outsider had learned not just how to win battles, but how to rule minds. And now, Europe was beginning to understand what that meant. By the time Napoleon Bonaparte consolidated power as first consul, he had already realized something most rulers never fully grasp. Wars are not won by bravery alone. They are won by systems. What Napoleon built next was not just an army, but a mechanism, precise, scalable, and terrifyingly efficient. One crucial fact about Napoleon is that he did not invent new weapons. Instead, he reinvented how existing ones were used. His greatest innovation was organizational. He divided his army into self-sufficient corps, each capable of marching independently, fighting alone if necessary, and rapidly combining with others at decisive moments. This structure gave his forces flexibility no European army could match. Speed became his signature. While traditional armies moved slowly to protect supply lines, Napoleon allowed his troops to live off the land. This reduced logistical burden and increased momentum, but it also brought suffering to civilians. For Napoleon, this was an acceptable cost. War, he believed, should be decisive, even brutal, so that it could end quickly. Ironically, this logic would later justify endless campaigns. Another fact often misunderstood is Napoleon's relationship with soldiers. He did not see them as expendable masses. He saw them as instruments that needed care, motivation, and belief. He paid attention to food, rest, and recognition. Medals, promotions, and titles were distributed generously to those who performed well. In Napoleon's army, advancement was theoretically open to talent. This promise, even when imperfectly fulfilled, inspired extraordinary loyalty. Yet loyalty alone was not enough. Napoleon demanded absolute obedience. Discipline under Napoleon was harsh, but predictable. Soldiers knew what was expected, and they knew the consequences of failure. This clarity reduced hesitation. On the battlefield, Napoleon's men moved with purpose because they trusted the system and the man directing it. He often placed himself near the front, observing terrain and timing attacks personally. This visibility strengthened the myth of his invincibility. One striking fact is that Napoleon rarely shouted orders. He spoke calmly, even during chaos. His composure became a psychological weapon. If the emperor was calm, the situation could not be hopeless. This perception mattered as much as tactics. As Napoleon defeated coalition after coalition, Europe struggled to adapt. Monarchies built armies for ceremonial wars, not existential ones. Napoleon's campaigns forced them to modernize or collapse. In this way, he unintentionally accelerated the transformation of Europe into the modern age. But war was only half the machine. Napoleon understood that victory on the battlefield meant little if it was not secured politically. He redrew borders, installed relatives on foreign thrones, and dismantled old states to create new ones loyal to France. The Kingdom of Italy, the Confederation of the Rhine, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, these were not random creations. They were buffers, extensions of French power disguised as independent nations. This strategy revealed another fact about Napoleon. He trusted blood over ideology. Despite revolutionary rhetoric, he placed brothers and sisters on thrones across Europe. Some were capable. Many were not. Napoleon believed loyalty was inherited, not earned. This assumption would later prove costly. At home, Napoleon worked just as relentlessly. He restructured education to produce obedient administrators and officers. Schools emphasized discipline, mathematics, and loyalty to the state. The press was tightly controlled. Newspapers were reduced in number and placed under strict censorship. Napoleon did not abolish free expression. He managed it. His reasoning was simple. Too many voices create confusion, and confusion breeds weakness. Perhaps the most enduring fact of Napoleon's domestic legacy is the Napoleonic Code. It standardized laws across France, ending the patchwork of regional legal systems. It guaranteed equality before the law, secular authority, and protection of property. However, it also reinforced patriarchal authority and limited women's rights severely. Napoleon believed order required hierarchy, even within families. This reveals an important truth. Napoleon was progressive where efficiency demanded it, conservative where control required it. Religion posed a unique challenge. The revolution had alienated the Catholic Church, destabilizing society. Napoleon solved this pragmatically. Through the Concordat of 1801, he restored the church's public role while keeping it subordinate to the state. Priests were paid by the government. Loyalty was expected. Faith became another tool of stability. Napoleon did not believe deeply in religion, but he believed deeply in its utility. By the early 1800s, France was no longer just a republic guided by revolutionary ideals. It was an empire in all but name. The transformation became official in 1804, when Napoleon crowned himself emperor. The symbolism was deliberate. He did not allow the Pope to place the crown on his head. He took it himself. The message was unmistakable. His authority came from no one but himself. Europe reacted with outrage and fear. Monarchs saw in Napoleon not just an enemy, but a threat to the entire concept of inherited rule. Coalition wars resumed with renewed intensity. Napoleon welcomed them. War validated his system. Each victory reinforced his legitimacy. Each defeat, he believed, could be corrected by the next campaign. But the machine he had built required constant motion. To stop conquering was to risk unraveling. And Napoleon Bonaparte was not a man who knew how to stop. By the mid-1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte had achieved what no European leader had managed in centuries, near total dominance of the continent. His armies had crushed Austria, humiliated Prussia, and forced Russia into uneasy cooperation. From Lisbon to Warsaw, rulers adjusted their decisions based on one question alone: what would Napoleon do? This era produced some of the most astonishing facts about Napoleon's military genius, but it also marked the moment when success began to distort his judgment. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805 stands as his masterpiece. Facing combined Russian and Austrian forces, Napoleon deliberately appeared weak, inviting his enemies to attack what they believed was his vulnerable flank. When they took the bait, he struck the center, splitting their army in two. The victory was so decisive that it ended the Third Coalition and cemented Napoleon's reputation as an unbeatable commander. What makes Austerlitz especially revealing is not just the strategy, but Napoleon's confidence. He had predicted enemy movements with near-perfect accuracy. This reinforced his belief that he understood war on a level others did not. From this point on, Napoleon trusted intuition as much as intelligence, and sometimes more. Victory, to him, was no longer evidence of good planning. It became proof of personal destiny. Another fact that shaped this period is Napoleon's increasing isolation. As emperor, fewer people dared to contradict him. Advisors learned that disagreement could mean exile or irrelevance. This gradually narrowed the information Napoleon received. He still worked relentlessly, but his decisions increasingly came from within an echo chamber of his own success. At Jena and Auerstedt in 1806, Napoleon annihilated Prussia in a matter of weeks. The Prussian army, once considered Europe's finest, collapsed under the speed and coordination of French forces. Berlin fell. The old military order shattered. Europe learned that reputation meant nothing against modern warfare. Yet Napoleon did not pause to consolidate peace. Instead, he turned his attention to Britain, the one enemy he could not defeat directly. Lacking naval superiority, Napoleon chose economic warfare. The continental system was designed to isolate Britain by banning European trade with it. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was disastrous. Smuggling flourished. Economies suffered. Allies grew resentful. This decision reveals a crucial fact about Napoleon. He often underestimated human behavior. Systems worked in his mind because people obeyed logic. But people obey incentives, fear, and survival. As hardship spread, loyalty weakened. Still, Napoleon pushed forward. His victories continued. At Friedland in 1807, he defeated Russia and met Tsar Alexander I on a raft in the middle of a river to negotiate peace. The image was theatrical and intentional. Napoleon understood symbolism. He presented himself as an equal to ancient emperors, shaping history through personal encounters. But beneath the grandeur, cracks were forming. Napoleon's empire had grown too fast. It depended on constant military success to enforce compliance. When wars were short, the system held. When they dragged on, resistance grew. Spain became the first warning. Napoleon installed his brother Joseph as king, assuming familial loyalty would ensure control. Instead, Spain erupted into guerrilla warfare. This was a new kind of enemy. Spanish fighters did not meet Napoleon's armies in open battle. They harassed supply lines, ambushed patrols, and vanished into the countryside. The French army, trained for decisive engagements, struggled. The war drained resources, morale, and attention. Napoleon famously called it the Spanish ulcer. The fact that he underestimated Spain is significant. He believed that once a state was defeated, its people would submit. He failed to understand nationalism as a force independent of governments. This blind spot would return with devastating consequences. At the same time, Napoleon's personal life reflected his political mindset. He divorced Josephine, the woman who had supported him from the beginning, because she could not give him an heir. The decision was calculated, not emotional. He married Marie-Louise of Austria to legitimize his dynasty. Love, like war, was subordinate to strategy. By 1810, Napoleon stood at the peak of his power. His empire spanned much of Europe. His enemies were exhausted. His name commanded fear and admiration in equal measure. Yet, paradoxically, this was the moment he became most vulnerable, because Napoleon had come to believe that he could not lose. Every previous crisis had been resolved through force. Every challenge had strengthened him. The pattern seemed undeniable. When faced with resistance, he attacked. When confronted with failure, he escalated. So when Russia began to undermine the continental system, Napoleon did not hesitate. He prepared for his greatest gamble, and history was about to teach him a lesson that no battlefield ever had. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte made the most consequential decision of his life. It was not driven by desperation, nor by immediate threat, but by a belief that had grown unchecked over years of victory, that any problem could be solved through overwhelming force. Russia, in Napoleon's mind, was simply another problem. The invasion of Russia stands as one of the most studied military campaigns in history, not because it failed in a conventional sense, but because it exposed the limits of control. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men, drawn from across his empire. French soldiers marched alongside Italians, Germans, Poles, and others, united not by loyalty, but by obligation. This diversity was both strength and weakness. One important fact, often overlooked, is that Napoleon never intended to conquer Russia completely. His goal was to force Tsar Alexander I back into compliance with the continental system. He expected a decisive battle near the border, followed by negotiations. Everything about his planning assumed that Russia would behave like Austria or Prussia. It did not. The Russian army retreated, refusing to engage. They burned crops, destroyed villages, and left nothing behind. This scorched earth strategy denied Napoleon's army the resources it depended on. For the first time, his system of living off the land collapsed. The deeper the French advanced, the weaker they became. Napoleon continued forward. This reveals a critical fact about his mindset. Napoleon equated retreat with failure. To pull back without a decisive battle felt like admitting defeat. He believed momentum itself was a weapon, and stopping would break it. As weeks passed, supply lines stretched impossibly long. Horses died. Discipline eroded. Yet Napoleon pressed on, convinced that one great victory would restore balance. When the armies finally clashed at Borodino, the battle was brutal and inconclusive. Both sides suffered massive casualties. The Russians withdrew again. Napoleon had technically won, but it was not the victory he needed. The Russian army remained intact. The war was not over. Then came Moscow. Napoleon entered the city expecting surrender. Instead, he found silence and fire. Much of Moscow burned. Whether by Russian design or chaos remains debated. What mattered was the result. Napoleon had captured a city with no government, no supplies, and no peace offer. For weeks, he waited. This waiting is one of the most revealing facts of Napoleon's career. The man known for speed and decisiveness hesitated. He could not accept that Tsar Alexander would not negotiate. He believed reason would prevail. Winter approached. Still, he delayed. When retreat finally came, it was too late. The Russian winter was not Napoleon's greatest enemy. Reality was. Cold, hunger, disease, and constant harassment destroyed the Grande Armée. Soldiers froze, starved, and collapsed by the tens of thousands. Discipline vanished. The once invincible army disintegrated into survivors struggling to escape. By the time the remnants crossed back into Europe, fewer than 100,000 remained. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Napoleon's aura of invincibility shattered. Allies sensed weakness. Enemies regrouped. For the first time, Europe saw that Napoleon could be beaten, not by brilliance, but by endurance. Yet even then, Napoleon did not abandon his core belief. He rebuilt. Another extraordinary fact is how quickly Napoleon recovered militarily. Within months, he raised a new army, relying increasingly on young, inexperienced conscripts. He still outmaneuvered enemies and won battles. His mind remained sharp, but the foundation had changed. Experience was gone. Loyalty was thinner. Fear replaced confidence. The campaigns of 1813 were desperate. At Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced a coalition that had learned from its mistakes. They avoided fragmentation, coordinated attacks, and outlasted him. Napoleon fought skillfully, but numbers and fatigue overwhelmed him. Defeat was no longer avoidable. By 1814, Allied armies marched into Paris. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba. For most rulers, this would have been the end. For Napoleon, it was merely an intermission, because one final, astonishing fact remained. Napoleon Bonaparte was not finished. Napoleon Bonaparte's exile to Elba was meant to neutralize him without creating a martyr. The island was small, isolated, and easy to monitor. He was given the title of ruler, a modest guard, and the illusion of dignity. Europe believed the problem had been solved. They underestimated the man they had built. One remarkable fact is how quickly Napoleon adapted to exile. He reorganized Elba's administration, improved infrastructure, and studied European politics obsessively. He followed news closely, noting dissatisfaction in France, the unpopularity of the restored Bourbon monarchy, and the divisions among the victorious powers. Napoleon did not see Elba as a prison. He saw it as a waiting room. In 1815, he escaped. The return from Elba is one of the most dramatic episodes in political history. Napoleon landed in southern France with only a small group of followers. He had no army, no guarantee of success, and everything to lose. Yet as he marched north, something extraordinary happened. Troops sent to arrest him defected. Soldiers recognized him. They remembered the glory, the promotions, the certainty he represented. When confronted by royal forces, Napoleon reportedly stepped forward and declared that if anyone wished to kill their emperor, they could do so now. No one fired. Paris fell without a fight. This moment reveals a profound fact about Napoleon's hold over the French military. Loyalty to him was emotional, not institutional. He represented an era when merit mattered, when victories felt meaningful, and when France dominated Europe. The Bourbon kings represented the past. Thus began the 100 Days. Napoleon returned to power knowing he had little time. Europe mobilized immediately. He attempted reforms, promising a more liberal constitution. Some of this was genuine. Much of it was strategic. Napoleon understood that his survival depended on unity at home and decisive action abroad. War, once again, was his solution. The campaign that followed would end at Waterloo. Contrary to popular myth, Waterloo was not a simple failure of genius. Napoleon's plan was sound. He aimed to defeat Allied armies separately before they could unite. Early engagements showed flashes of his old brilliance, but time had changed everything. Napoleon was no longer the man he had been. Illness plagued him. Fatigue slowed him. His subordinates lacked his experience. Communication faltered. At critical moments, orders were delayed or misunderstood. The margin for error that once favored him now punished him. At Waterloo, factors converged against him. Rain delayed the battle. Terrain limited movement. Allied coordination held. When Prussian forces arrived unexpectedly, the balance tipped irreversibly. Napoleon fought until the end, but this time there was no escape. Defeat was final. Napoleon abdicated again, hoping for asylum in Britain. Instead, he was exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, far beyond the reach of influence or return. There would be no second escape. The man who had ruled Europe was now confined to a rock in the ocean. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon remained dangerous, not militarily, but historically. St. Helena was designed to end Napoleon Bonaparte, not physically, but symbolically. Isolated, heavily guarded, and cut off from Europe, the island ensured that no armies could rally, no legends could spread, and no return could be imagined. What his captors failed to understand was that Napoleon no longer needed power to shape the world. He needed time. One of the most important facts about Napoleon's final years is that he treated exile as a continuation of war. Only now, the battlefield was memory. Deprived of command, he turned to narrative. He dictated memoirs, held long conversations with companions, and carefully framed every event of his life. He did not deny his failures. He explained them, and in doing so, he transformed them. Napoleon presented himself as a tragic hero, undone not by ambition or miscalculation, but by fate, betrayal, and the jealousy of lesser men. Russia became an act of necessity. Waterloo became a failure of subordinates. Exile became martyrdom. These interpretations were not accidental. Napoleon understood that history does not remember facts. It remembers stories. And he intended to win that battle. Life on St. Helena was harsh. The climate was unforgiving. Supplies were limited. British authorities, especially Governor Hudson Lowe, imposed strict rules that Napoleon interpreted as deliberate humiliation. He complained constantly, but not merely out of bitterness. Every complaint fed the image of a great man unjustly treated. This strategy worked. European public opinion slowly shifted. Writers, artists, and intellectuals began to see Napoleon not as a tyrant, but as a fallen giant. Romanticism embraced him. He became a symbol of genius crushed by mediocrity. This transformation was not spontaneous. It was cultivated. Another revealing fact is Napoleon's attitude toward death. He believed deeply that reputation outlived flesh. As his health declined, likely from stomach cancer, though debate persists, he became more focused on posterity. He revised his accounts, emphasized his reforms, and highlighted his role as a lawgiver rather than a conqueror. When Napoleon died in 1821, he was 51 years old. The reaction across Europe was striking. Governments remained cautious, but the public mourned. His name carried power even in death. Decades later, his remains were returned to France in a grand ceremony. The empire was gone, but the legend had matured. Perhaps the most enduring fact about Napoleon is that he changed how leadership is perceived. Before him, rulers inherited authority. After him, authority could be seized, justified by competence and vision. He proved that a single individual, armed with intellect and ambition, could reshape entire continents. But his legacy is not purely inspirational. Napoleon normalized total war. He blurred the line between civilian and soldier. He centralized power to an unprecedented degree. Many of the authoritarian systems of the modern era trace structural lineage back to him. Efficiency, when detached from restraint, became dangerous. This duality ensures that Napoleon remains endlessly debated. Was he a hero of meritocracy, or a dictator in revolutionary clothing? A liberator or an occupier? A modernizer or a destroyer? The truth is uncomfortable. He was all of them. Napoleon once said that a soldier will fight long and hard for a bit of colored ribbon. Critics mocked this statement as cynical. In reality, it reveals his understanding of human psychology. People fight for meaning, recognition, and identity. Napoleon gave them that even as he used it. And that is why he still matters. Because Napoleon Bonaparte was not merely a man of his time. He was a prototype of the modern world, its ambitions, its contradictions, and its costs. Few historical figures have been reduced to caricature as thoroughly as Napoleon Bonaparte. Over 2 centuries of propaganda, satire, admiration, and resentment have distorted him into extremes, either a comic villain or a flawless genius. The truth, as always, is far more complex and far more interesting. One of the most persistent myths is Napoleon's height. He is often portrayed as unusually short, giving rise to the so-called Napoleon complex. In reality, Napoleon was about 5 feet 6 to 5 feet 7 inches tall, by modern measurements, average for his time. The misconception arose from differences between French and British units of measurement, combined with British propaganda eager to belittle him. This detail matters because it shows how even physical facts were weaponized to diminish his authority. Napoleon understood this better than anyone. He was acutely aware of image and symbolism. He often surrounded himself with tall guards, not to compensate for insecurity, but to amplify his own presence through contrast. He chose poses, uniforms, and settings carefully. When depicted on horseback, he was shown calm, while others struggled. When painted crossing the Alps, he was heroic, even though the actual crossing was cold, slow, and uncomfortable. Another misunderstood fact is Napoleon's intelligence. He was not a polymath in the Renaissance sense, but his mind was exceptionally structured. He thought in systems. He could process large amounts of information rapidly, categorize it, and act decisively. This made him a formidable administrator as well as a general. He dictated letters simultaneously to multiple secretaries, switching topics effortlessly. Yet his intelligence had limits. Napoleon excelled at problems with clear variables: armies, logistics, laws. He struggled with human unpredictability, especially when it came to collective emotion. Nationalism, religious fervor, and cultural identity were forces he never fully understood. He believed people could be reorganized like institutions. Spain and Russia proved otherwise. Napoleon's relationships reveal another layer of his character. He was deeply attached to Josephine, despite her infidelities and their political incompatibility. Her presence grounded him emotionally. After their divorce, his letters became colder, more transactional. His second marriage produced an heir, but not companionship. This suggests a man who sacrificed intimacy for legacy and paid for it in isolation. Contrary to popular belief, Napoleon was not constantly furious or theatrical. In private, he could be quiet, ironic, even playful. He enjoyed simple meals, long walks, and conversations about literature. He disliked ceremony and found court etiquette tedious. This disconnect between the man and the role often frustrated those around him. Another important fact concerns Napoleon's attitude toward freedom. He genuinely believed in equality of opportunity for men. He dismantled aristocratic privilege, opened careers to talent, and promoted based on merit. But he also censored the press, restricted political dissent, and reintroduced slavery in French colonies. His version of freedom was conditional, freedom to serve the state effectively. This contradiction is central to understanding him. Napoleon did not trust abstract liberty. He trusted order. To him, chaos was the enemy of progress. This belief justified repression in his mind. If control produced stability, and stability produced prosperity, then control was moral. This logic echoes throughout modern authoritarian systems, and it began, in part, with him. Even Napoleon's death is surrounded by myth. Some claimed he was poisoned, others believed he was slowly murdered. Modern analysis suggests stomach cancer, possibly aggravated by poor conditions. The debate itself reflects how difficult it is for the world to accept an ordinary end for an extraordinary figure, because ordinary endings weaken legends. Perhaps the most revealing fact is that Napoleon was aware of this. He knew that how he was remembered would matter more than how he ruled. His exile writings were not confessions, they were constructions. He shaped his memory deliberately, leaving historians to untangle intention from reality. And yet, despite manipulation, the core remains undeniable. Napoleon Bonaparte changed Europe permanently. He accelerated the spread of modern law, bureaucracy, and warfare. He destroyed old regimes and inspired new ones. He terrified kings and empowered commoners. He demonstrated both the potential and the danger of individual brilliance, unrestrained by limits. That is why myths cling to him, because Napoleon is not just history. He is a mirror. Each generation sees in him what it fears or admires most. Napoleon Bonaparte did not simply belong to history. History reorganized itself around him. Long after his empire collapsed, the structures he built and the reactions he provoked continued to shape the modern world in ways that are often invisible but profound. One crucial fact about Napoleon's legacy is that nearly every major European political system of the 19th century was, in some way, a response to him. Constitutions were rewritten, armies restructured, borders reconsidered, and ideologies hardened because of what Napoleon proved was possible. He showed that mass mobilization, centralized authority, and national identity could transform a state into an unstoppable force. Modern warfare begins with Napoleon. Before him, wars were limited affairs fought by professional armies. After him, war became national. Entire populations were mobilized. Economies were redirected. Civilian life was no longer separate from conflict. This model influenced military thinkers from Clausewitz to modern generals who studied Napoleon not just for tactics, but for principles: concentration of force, decisive engagement, and speed. Clausewitz himself fought against Napoleon and learned from defeat. Another lasting fact is Napoleon's influence on nationalism. Ironically, while he sought to dominate Europe, he awakened national consciousness wherever he went. Occupied peoples began to define themselves in opposition to French rule. Spain, Germany, Italy, and even Russia experienced a surge of identity precisely because they resisted him. In this sense, Napoleon helped create the very forces that would later dismantle empires. This unintended consequence reshaped Europe. Politically, Napoleon normalized the idea that legitimacy could come from competence rather than bloodline. Even after monarchies were restored, rulers could no longer ignore public opinion or administrative efficiency. Governments became more bureaucratic, more centralized, and more focused on results. The modern state, capable, intrusive, organized, owes much to Napoleon's example. Yet this efficiency came at a cost. Napoleon's model concentrated power in the executive, reducing checks and balances. Many later leaders admired this aspect more than his reforms. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, authoritarian rulers would invoke Napoleon as proof that strong leadership justified curtailed freedoms. His name became shorthand for decisive rule, even when stripped of context. This selective memory is itself a fact worth noting. Napoleon's legal legacy is more concrete. The Napoleonic Code influenced civil law systems across Europe, Latin America, and beyond. Principles like equality before the law, secular authority, and standardized legal procedures became foundational. Even countries that fought against him adopted versions of his legal reforms. In this way, Napoleon's ideas survived where his armies did not. Education systems followed a similar pattern. Centralized curricula, state examinations, and merit-based advancement became common. Napoleon believed education should serve the state by producing loyal, capable citizens. Modern public education reflects this philosophy more than is often acknowledged. Culturally, Napoleon transformed how society views ambition. Before him, excessive ambition was often portrayed as dangerous hubris. After him, it became a virtue, if paired with talent. The idea that an individual could rise from obscurity to dominate history inspired countless figures, from revolutionaries to entrepreneurs. But it also inspired cautionary tales. Literature and art wrestled with Napoleon's example. He appeared as hero and villain, genius and tyrant. Writers like Tolstoy portrayed him as a man swept along by forces larger than himself, challenging the myth of individual control. This debate, whether history is shaped by great men or by impersonal forces, became central to modern historical thought because of Napoleon. Even today, leaders are compared to him. Another enduring fact is that Napoleon changed how failure is interpreted. His defeats did not erase his achievements. Instead, they became part of his legend. This reframing taught future leaders that narrative can outlast outcomes. Managing perception became as important as managing reality, a lesson embraced by modern politics. Napoleon's life also serves as a warning. Unchecked success can distort judgment. Systems that rely on constant expansion eventually collapse. Loyalty based on victory fades when defeat arrives. These patterns repeat across history, in empires, corporations, and movements alike. Napoleon's story provides a template for both rise and fall. And yet, fascination persists. Why does Napoleon still command attention? Because he embodies the tension at the heart of modernity. The desire for order versus the demand for freedom. The celebration of talent versus the fear of domination. The promise of progress versus its human cost. Napoleon did not resolve these tensions. He intensified them. That is why his shadow remains. In law, in war, in politics, and in ambition itself, Napoleon Bonaparte continues to influence a world that officially moved on, but never truly escaped him. To understand Napoleon Bonaparte fully, one must step inside the machinery of his mind. He was more than a general or emperor. He was a thinker of relentless calculation, driven by an insatiable need to impose order on chaos. Every action, every campaign, every reform was filtered through a mind that combined intelligence, intuition, and obsession in a way few humans have ever displayed. One essential fact about Napoleon is his obsession with time and efficiency. He famously slept very little, often 4 to 5 hours per night, and worked tirelessly the rest. He dictated letters to multiple secretaries simultaneously, handled domestic and military correspondence, and analyzed maps late into the night. Time was a resource he measured like an army counts supplies. Every minute spent improperly was a tactical error. Napoleon's attention to detail was extraordinary. He memorized names, faces, and capabilities of his generals. He read reports critically, corrected minor errors in logistics personally, and demanded precision from all his subordinates. Yet he paired this micromanagement with strategic vision, seeing the battlefield, the nation, and the continent as interconnected systems. Few leaders in history combined this level of operational depth with macro-scale ambition. Ambition, however, was both a gift and a curse. Napoleon's need for greatness went beyond personal glory. It was rooted in insecurity. From childhood, he had felt marginalized, mocked for his Corsican accent, his modest upbringing, and his outsider status in elite French society. These early experiences planted a persistent hunger. He would never again be ignored. Power, to Napoleon, was validation, a shield against irrelevance. This psychological insight explains his relentless campaigns. Even when political objectives were achieved, he often pursued further conquests. Defeat, hesitation, or inactivity was intolerable to him. He equated passivity with failure, and success with survival, not just physically, but historically. Discipline, another hallmark of his personality, extended to himself as much as to others. Napoleon exercised strict control over his diet, his sleep, and his daily schedule. He believed the body could be trained to support the mind's demands. Soldiers who experienced his regimen on campaign often remarked on his endurance. He could march longer, fight harder, and make decisions faster than almost anyone else. Yet, for all his self-control, Napoleon was not immune to ego. His sense of destiny shaped his perception of events. Victories reinforced his belief in personal brilliance. Losses were interpreted as temporary obstacles or the failure of others. In Russia, in Spain, and finally at Waterloo, the same patterns repeated. When circumstances defied him, he adapted, but never fully conceded that limits existed. Another fascinating fact is Napoleon's psychological understanding of others. He knew that men could be inspired, manipulated, and frightened, and he used this knowledge to maintain control. Promotions were given to talent, not birth. Praise was used strategically. Fear was administered sparingly, but consistently. This created loyalty based on both admiration and necessity, a combination more resilient than either alone. Napoleon's mind also thrived on complexity. He was comfortable juggling multiple theaters of war, administrative reforms, and personal relationships at the same time. Where most humans would feel overwhelmed, Napoleon found stimulation. This capacity for simultaneous reasoning allowed him to see connections others missed, whether in logistics, strategy, or diplomacy. Finally, it is worth noting his relationship with history itself. Napoleon believed deeply in legacy. He understood that mortal life was fleeting, but memory could be eternal. Even in exile, he wrote, dictated, and reshaped his narrative. Success was never enough. What mattered was being remembered as he wanted to be remembered. His obsession with legacy fueled his ambition, disciplined his habits, and framed his defeats as chapters in a grand story. Napoleon Bonaparte's mind, therefore, was a paradox, a combination of ruthless calculation, disciplined obsession, profound insecurity, and extraordinary vision. It allowed him to rise from obscurity, to dominate Europe, but it also sowed the seeds of overreach. In studying his psychology, we see why he was capable of both unparalleled brilliance and catastrophic mistakes. A man who was, simultaneously, a genius and a cautionary tale. Napoleon Bonaparte's genius extended beyond the battlefield. While history often emphasizes his military campaigns, an equally profound legacy lies in the institutions, laws, and systems he built, many of which continue to shape modern governance today. He was not merely a conqueror. He was an administrator of extraordinary skill, a reformer who combined efficiency with authoritarian control. One of the most significant facts about Napoleon's domestic policy is the creation of the Napoleonic Code. This legal system replaced the chaotic patchwork of regional laws in France with a uniform civil code. It enshrined principles such as equality before the law, secular authority, and protection of property. The Napoleonic Code was revolutionary because it codified meritocracy, birth, and social status, no longer determined legal or civil rights. Across Europe and Latin America, many nations adopted variants of this code, demonstrating Napoleon's lasting influence on civil law. Equally notable is his reform of education. Napoleon recognized that a strong state required competent administrators, loyal officials, and disciplined citizens. He established lycées, state-run secondary schools that emphasized mathematics, science, and civic instruction. These schools were designed to produce future military officers, civil servants, and engineers, ensuring the state's functionality. Education under Napoleon was practical and ideological. It trained citizens who could serve the state efficiently while reinforcing loyalty to centralized authority. Another often overlooked fact is Napoleon's approach to bureaucracy. He streamlined tax collection, created a merit-based civil service, and implemented standardized record-keeping. France became a highly organized state, capable of mobilizing resources rapidly. While the Napoleonic system was rigid, it was remarkably efficient compared to the patchwork governance that existed before the Revolution. This model of centralized administration influenced European states for decades, establishing the blueprint for modern bureaucracies. Napoleon also redefined the relationship between the state and religion. Through the Concordat of 1801, he reconciled France with the Catholic Church, restoring public worship, while maintaining state supremacy over clergy and finances. This pragmatic approach balanced social stability with political control, demonstrating his skill at manipulating institutions to serve both order and authority. Another important fact is Napoleon's focus on meritocracy in governance. Promotions and appointments were increasingly based on ability rather than aristocratic birth. He rewarded competence and loyalty, creating an elite class of officials whose authority was grounded in skill rather than lineage. This approach extended into his military as well, where talented soldiers could rise to command despite humble origins, a revolutionary idea in an era defined by hereditary privilege. Infrastructure and public works also flourished under Napoleon. Roads, bridges, canals, and administrative buildings were constructed or modernized, improving communication, trade, and military mobility. These projects not only enhanced France's strategic capabilities, but also demonstrated a visionary understanding of logistics and urban planning, aspects often overshadowed by his military fame. Napoleon's approach to governance combined strict control with innovation. He centralized power, but he also modernized systems that were previously inefficient or corrupt. This duality is crucial. It illustrates why Napoleon is remembered not only as a warrior, but also as a state builder. Many of the administrative principles he implemented, standardized laws, merit-based appointments, centralized taxation, and national education, remain foundational in modern governance worldwide. Finally, Napoleon's reforms reveal a deeper pattern in his character. He approached governance as he approached war, with strategic foresight, operational precision, and an unrelenting focus on results. Just as he sought decisive victories on the battlefield, he pursued decisive efficiency in the state. This reveals a continuity between his mind as a military strategist and as a reformer. Napoleon Bonaparte was not merely shaping France for his time. He was designing a system built to outlast him, and in many ways it did. From law to education to bureaucratic efficiency, the traces of his genius remain embedded in institutions that endure more than 2 centuries later. Napoleon Bonaparte understood that conquest alone could not secure power. Diplomacy, alliances, and manipulation were equally critical. His approach to Europe was strategic, transactional, and often ruthless, revealing a side of him that was as calculating as his battlefield maneuvers. While military victories drew attention, his diplomatic skill ensured that France retained influence long after battles ended. One essential fact about Napoleon's diplomacy is how he used marriage as a political tool. His first marriage to Josephine was personal, but when dynastic succession became urgent, he divorced her to marry Marie-Louise of Austria, tying France to the Habsburgs. Through this union, Napoleon sought legitimacy and peace with a powerful neighbor. It was a pragmatic move. Love was secondary to consolidation of power. Napoleon's relationships with his siblings and relatives also served political purposes. He installed brothers and sisters as kings, queens, and rulers across Europe. Joseph in Spain, Louis in Holland, Jerome in Westphalia, Elisa in Tuscany. These placements were intended to secure loyalty and stabilize regions under French influence. While the effectiveness of this strategy varied, it highlights a key fact. Napoleon understood that family could be leveraged to extend political control beyond direct conquest. His alliances were similarly transactional. Napoleon forged temporary coalitions, such as with Austria, after Austerlitz, only to abandon them when they no longer served French interests. He manipulated treaties, finances, and marriages to maximize advantage. Europe learned quickly that agreements with Napoleon were conditional. Loyalty and stability depended on his perception of utility rather than mutual respect or morality. Another revealing fact is Napoleon's psychological approach to diplomacy. He treated negotiations as extensions of battlefield strategy. He calculated not only what his opponents could do, but how they thought he would act. By projecting confidence, decisiveness, and inevitability, he often coerced rivals into concessions without firing a shot. Even when opposed by seasoned statesmen, Napoleon's reputation created leverage that amplified his real power. Napoleon's treatment of defeated states was similarly strategic. In Italy, he installed client republics and then reorganized them into kingdoms loyal to France. In the Confederation of the Rhine, German states were consolidated under French influence. Poland, though partitioned, was partially resurrected as the Duchy of Warsaw under French control. This network of satellite states extended French influence, created buffers, and demonstrated that Napoleon viewed diplomacy as a tool for long-term stability as well as immediate advantage. Yet, Napoleon's diplomacy had limitations. He relied heavily on personal relationships and psychological dominance. When his aura of invincibility faded, particularly after the Russian campaign, loyalty eroded quickly. Alliances dissolved, satellite states rebelled, and former allies joined coalitions against him. This highlights a critical fact. Napoleon's diplomatic power was inseparable from his military success. Without victories, influence diminished rapidly. Napoleon also understood the symbolic power of treaties, ceremonies, and public perception. The Congress of Erfurt in 1808, for instance, was less about negotiation and more about reinforcing his image as Europe's supreme authority. He met Alexander I of Russia, not merely to discuss terms, but to demonstrate dominance, projecting calm, command, and inevitability. Such displays reinforced fear, respect, and psychological leverage across the continent. In summary, Napoleon's diplomacy was inseparable from his broader strategic vision. It combined coercion, persuasion, symbolism, and calculated risk. By treating Europe itself as a complex system to manipulate, he was able to extend French influence far beyond what his armies alone could accomplish. His approach reminds us that power is rarely absolute. It is managed through perception, negotiation, and the careful calibration of incentives. Europe, under Napoleon, was a chessboard, and he was the player who thought several moves ahead, balancing armies, marriages, treaties, and personalities simultaneously. Yet, as history would later show, even this genius had its limits. One miscalculation could, and eventually did, unravel the carefully constructed empire. By 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte had transformed Europe. Empires had been toppled, kingdoms rearranged, and new legal and administrative systems implemented across the continent. Yet his greatest challenge was not external enemies. It was the very success he had created. Ambition, when unchecked, became a double-edged sword, and the seeds of overreach were already sown. One crucial fact about Napoleon's final campaigns is that they were shaped as much by his psychological tendencies as by military necessity. Victory had become addictive. Each success reinforced a belief in personal destiny and the inevitability of triumph. Where prudence might have advised consolidation, Napoleon pushed further, convinced that decisive action could resolve complex geopolitical challenges. This mindset led directly to the Russian invasion of 1812, a campaign that would change everything. The invasion itself highlights another revealing fact. Napoleon underestimated the power of logistics, climate, and nationalism when applied on a continental scale. He had conquered nations that operated within traditional European norms, but Russia functioned differently. The scorched earth tactics employed by the Russians denied his armies vital resources. Winter, which in previous wars had been an obstacle manageable through discipline and preparation, became a lethal enemy. Napoleon's meticulously planned system of rapid, mobile warfare could not adapt to environmental and cultural variables beyond his control. Napoleon's reliance on personal intuition, which had been an asset throughout his career, became a liability. He had trusted his judgment over advisors, assuming his experience would guide him to victory. Yet in Russia, and later at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, this overconfidence met the limits of strategy. Coalition forces adapted, coordinated, and exploited weaknesses that his genius could no longer compensate for. His failure was not merely tactical, it was systemic. The machine he had built required constant motion, but the world had begun to resist. Another critical fact is the role of human endurance and morale. Napoleon had excelled when he could motivate armies through shared purpose, rapid victories, and clear leadership. By the late campaigns, French armies were composed increasingly of inexperienced conscripts and foreigners. Morale wavered. Obedience was not absolute. The psychological cohesion that had made earlier triumphs possible began to crumble, illustrating the delicate balance between personal authority and institutional structure. Waterloo in 1815 encapsulates this culmination of overreach. Napoleon sought to defeat the Allied forces in Belgium before they could unite. His plan was bold, rooted in the same principles of mobility, surprise, and concentrated force that had brought him fame. But the conditions were unfavorable. Muddy terrain slowed movements, communication broke down, and subordinates failed to execute orders with precision. Moreover, the Prussian army arrived unexpectedly, tipping the scales. Victory, which had been nearly synonymous with Napoleon himself, was now no longer guaranteed. The fall of Napoleon reveals a fundamental truth. Genius has limits. Ambition can outpace resources, perception, and the forces of nature. The combination of overconfidence, misjudgment, and external pressures exposed vulnerabilities that had been invisible at the height of power. Success had, ironically, blinded him to the inevitability of resistance and the consequences of expansion. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon's actions illustrate a remarkable consistency. He continued to plan, to negotiate, and to protect the remnants of his legacy. His surrender, exile, and eventual containment on St. Helena were managed with the same strategic calculation that had defined his entire career. Even powerless, he remained a formidable presence, a reminder that history is shaped as much by narrative and perception as by physical control. Napoleon's overreach teaches an enduring lesson. Systems, whether military, political, or personal, have thresholds. Genius can expand them temporarily, but unchecked ambition inevitably collides with limits beyond individual control. His story is both an example of extraordinary achievement and a cautionary tale about the fragility of human design when confronted with complexity, unpredictability, and resistance. Napoleon Bonaparte's exile to St. Helena in 1815 marked the final chapter of his physical power, but it became the opening chapter of his enduring influence. Isolated in the South Atlantic, under strict British supervision, he faced a reality he had never before experienced: impotence. He could no longer command armies, redraw borders, or negotiate treaties. Yet even in this confinement, Napoleon exercised a different form of authority over memory, narrative, and history itself. One of the most remarkable facts about his final years is how systematically he shaped his legacy. Napoleon dictated memoirs, wrote letters, and held extended conversations with aides and companions. Every account emphasized his reasoning, justified his decisions, and framed his failures within a narrative of inevitability, betrayal, or circumstance beyond his control. Unlike many fallen rulers, he did not allow others to define his story. He became his own historian. Napoleon's reflections during exile reveal a man both pragmatic and philosophical. He examined the nature of power, leadership, and human behavior with the same analytical rigor he had applied to battles and governance. He recognized that control over territory is temporary, but control over ideas is enduring. By carefully recording his perspective, he ensured that future generations would understand and debate his actions on his terms. Life on St. Helena was harsh. The climate was oppressive, the isolation total, and the British authorities strict, often creating friction over perceived slights. Napoleon complained incessantly, but these complaints were strategic as well as personal. Each letter, each recorded grievance, served to reinforce the image of a great man constrained by injustice rather than incompetence. Even his suffering became part of the carefully constructed legend. Another fact worth noting is Napoleon's intellectual curiosity. He read extensively, discussing history, politics, science, and philosophy with his attendants. He analyzed past empires and rulers, comparing strategies and lessons learned. These reflections were not idle. They were exercises in refining thought, understanding human nature, and preparing for the final act, securing his place in history. Napoleon also used exile to consolidate his sense of identity and destiny. He compared himself to Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Charlemagne, situating his life within a continuum of extraordinary leaders. By doing so, he framed his failures as temporary setbacks in a narrative arc that remained inevitable. his greatness would endure even after death. Physical decline accompanied these intellectual pursuits. Likely suffering from stomach cancer, Napoleon's health deteriorated steadily. Yet he maintained discipline, overseeing the day-to-day organization of his household, dictating texts, and continuing correspondence. This endurance reflects a deeper fact about his character. For Napoleon, influence was never contingent solely on strength or mobility. Even incapacitated, he remained a center of gravity for thought, memory, and legend. The strategic construction of legacy also involved controlling the narrative around mistakes. Campaigns like Russia and Waterloo were framed as tactical misjudgments, exacerbated by external factors, not failures of genius. Allies' betrayals, weather, and logistical anomalies were emphasized. By presenting these as the primary causes of defeat, he maintained the perception of personal brilliance, even in circumstances where objective analysis suggested overreach. Finally, Napoleon's time on St. Helena reveals the extraordinary interplay between power and storytelling. While empires crumble and armies disperse, stories endure. He understood this better than most. By crafting his own narrative, he ensured that history would remain engaged with him long after he could no longer influence the real world. His exile, intended to end his influence, became the very medium through which his legend grew. Napoleon died on May 5, 1821, at age 51. Physically confined and politically powerless, he nonetheless left a world transformed and a legacy meticulously engineered. His final years demonstrate that while empires are temporary, ideas, reputation, and memory can be wielded as tools of power in their own right, sometimes with more enduring effect than armies or decrees. Napoleon Bonaparte's death marked the end of his life, but not the end of his influence. Across law, military strategy, governance, and leadership theory, his legacy continues to shape the modern world. Understanding these enduring facts is essential to grasping why Napoleon remains one of history's most studied and debated figures. One of the clearest examples of his lasting impact is the Napoleonic Code. Beyond France, versions of this civil law system were adopted in Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, and Latin America. The Code introduced principles of equality before the law, standardized civil procedures, and property protections. It also reinforced patriarchy and limited women's rights, demonstrating how reforms can simultaneously advance and constrain society. This duality captures a larger truth about Napoleon. His systems were efficient, durable, and designed to reflect his understanding of human nature and order. Military strategy remains another domain where Napoleon's influence is undeniable. His campaigns are studied in military academies worldwide, not only for tactics, but for operational art. The coordination of large forces across geography, logistics, and time. Concepts like the core system, rapid maneuver, concentration of force at decisive points, and combined arms operations are foundational to modern military doctrine. Generals from World War I to World War II explicitly referenced his principles, adapting them to technology and scale. Napoleon's approach to leadership is equally instructive. He demonstrated the power of personal example, clarity of purpose, and psychological insight. He motivated soldiers through merit-based promotion, recognition, and shared purpose. He understood the balance of fear and loyalty, reward and consequence. Modern leadership theory draws heavily from these principles, illustrating how charisma, discipline, and strategic communication can amplify organizational performance. Yet his life also warns of the dangers of overreach, isolation, and unchecked ego, lessons that remain relevant to leaders in business, politics, and military spheres alike. Another enduring fact is his influence on governance. Napoleon centralized bureaucracies, standardized administration, and improved infrastructure, creating a model of state efficiency that inspired reforms across Europe. Modern civil service systems, standardized examinations, and meritocratic appointments echo his vision. Even where authoritarian tendencies emerged, the structural benefits, predictable governance, coordinated logistics, and functional law persisted long after his political power vanished. Culturally and psychologically, Napoleon left a mark as well. He became a symbol of ambition, genius, and human possibility. Artists, writers, and historians have debated his character for generations, portraying him alternately as tyrant, liberator, strategist, and tragic hero. The fascination with his personality, the blend of brilliance, obsession, and hubris, continues to captivate scholars and the public alike. Napoleon's life also provides enduring lessons about limits and consequences. His victories demonstrate the extraordinary potential of talent, vision, and discipline. His defeats reveal how overconfidence, miscalculation, and environmental constraints can undermine even the greatest systems. The interplay between genius and vulnerability, ambition and reality, remains a cautionary tale for individuals and societies alike. Perhaps the most profound fact about Napoleon is that he continues to serve as a mirror. His story challenges us to consider the balance between power and responsibility, innovation and restraint, freedom and control. In law, governance, warfare, and leadership, his example is both inspirational and cautionary. We study Napoleon not merely to understand the past, but to understand ourselves, the ambitions we pursue, the systems we create, and the legacies we leave behind. Napoleon Bonaparte transformed Europe, not just with armies and battles, but with ideas, systems, and vision. Even 2 centuries after his death, his life reminds us that greatness is complex, multifaceted, and always intertwined with human limitation. Ambition can reshape the world, but only if it is tempered by awareness, adaptability, and respect for the unpredictable forces of history. And perhaps that is the ultimate fact about Napoleon. He remains a lesson in the possibilities and perils of human potential. Even after centuries, Napoleon Bonaparte surprises historians and enthusiasts with lesser-known facts about his personality, habits, and quirks. These details humanize a figure often portrayed as a machine of conquest, offering insights into the mind behind the legend. One fascinating fact is Napoleon's obsession with cleanliness and personal hygiene. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he bathed frequently and maintained meticulous grooming standards, often setting an example for his officers. He believed that discipline in appearance reflected discipline in thought and action, a principle he applied rigorously to both himself and his military. Napoleon was also an early advocate of mental preparation. He reportedly spent hours visualizing battles, considering multiple scenarios, and rehearsing decisions in his mind before acting. This habit of mental simulation was a form of preparation that allowed him to react to complex situations with apparent spontaneity, a skill that often appeared as genius to those around him. Despite his legendary focus on efficiency, Napoleon enjoyed moments of indulgence and leisure. He loved music, particularly Italian opera, and could play the flute. He had a taste for fine food, though he preferred simple, hearty meals on campaign for practicality. These humanizing details reveal a man who, while driven by ambition, still appreciated art, culture, and the pleasures of life. Another little-known fact is his affinity for animals. Napoleon was particularly fond of horses and maintained a personal stable. His skill in horsemanship extended beyond utility. It was part of his public persona. Riding confidently through battlefields and ceremonial events, he used horses as both a practical tool and a symbol of command, reinforcing the image of control and authority. Napoleon was also highly superstitious, though subtly. He carried charms and medallions for luck, interpreted omens, and sometimes delayed decisions based on favorable or unfavorable signs. This belief in fate coexisted with his rational, analytical mind, illustrating a fascinating duality between calculated strategy and psychological reliance on luck. A revealing fact about his communication style is that Napoleon dictated letters and orders with incredible speed, yet each message was carefully phrased to convey authority, clarity, and motivation. He understood that words could inspire troops, intimidate enemies, or reassure allies. His mastery of language in governance and warfare contributed significantly to his ability to control events and perceptions. Napoleon also had a keen interest in science and engineering. He studied maps meticulously, experimented with artillery placement, and consulted engineers on bridges, roads, and canals. His campaigns were logistical marvels in large part due to this technical understanding, blending intellect with practical problem solving. One quirky anecdote illustrates both his discipline and peculiarities. Napoleon was said to work late into the night, surrounded by officers and secretaries, yet would nap briefly in the middle of the day on horseback or at his desk. This micro-sleep approach maximized his mental efficiency and allowed him to maintain incredible stamina during prolonged campaigns. Perhaps the most telling fact about Napoleon's personal life is his complex relationships. While he used marriages for political advantage, he maintained a genuine, deep affection for Josephine, his first wife, which persisted even after their divorce. His letters reveal tenderness, vulnerability, and longing, qualities that contrast sharply with his public image as an unyielding emperor. Even in exile, Napoleon's intellect and curiosity did not diminish. On St. Helena, he dissected European history, compared civilizations, and formulated theories on governance, leadership, and strategy. He remained engaged with the world, not as a participant, but as a chronicler, thinker, and manipulator of his own narrative. These lesser-known facts remind us that Napoleon Bonaparte was not merely a symbol of power or ambition. He was a human being, intricate, contradictory, and endlessly fascinating. Understanding these personal details enriches our comprehension of his decisions, strategies, and the enduring allure of his legend. Napoleon Bonaparte's personal quirks and habits were not mere eccentricities. They were deeply intertwined with his approach to leadership. His ability to inspire loyalty, maintain discipline, and simultaneously command fear stemmed from a combination of psychological insight, charisma, and deliberate calculation. One essential fact about Napoleon's leadership style is that he tailored his approach to individuals. He recognized that different personalities required different motivators. Talented subordinates were rewarded with authority and prestige, while weaker officers were often publicly corrected or demoted. This selective reinforcement created an environment where ambition aligned with obedience, producing highly motivated, capable leaders who were intensely loyal to him. Napoleon's personal example was another cornerstone of his authority. He led from the front in battles, often placing himself in visible, symbolic positions of courage. Soldiers observed him riding calmly amid chaos, issuing orders with clarity and decisiveness. This visibility reinforced both admiration and fear. Troops believed he would share their danger, but expected absolute discipline. Leadership by example was both motivational and coercive, cementing his control over vast armies. Another revealing fact is how Napoleon understood the psychological dynamics of fear. He rarely relied on brute punishment. Instead, he wielded fear strategically. A reprimand, a demotion, or public criticism at the right moment could enforce obedience without breeding rebellion. He combined this with personal charisma and fairness, ensuring that fear did not overwhelm loyalty. Soldiers respected him not just as an authority figure, but as a figure who could reward merit while exposing incompetence. Napoleon's communication skills amplified his effectiveness. He dictated orders with precision and clarity, ensuring that intentions were unambiguous. Speeches, proclamations, and letters were crafted to inspire, intimidate, or manipulate perception, depending on the audience. This mastery of language, combined with strategic action, created a feedback loop where perception and reality reinforced each other. His enemies feared him, and his followers revered him. The duality of loyalty and fear extended beyond the military into his governance. Civil administrators, diplomats, and allies were subject to intense scrutiny, rewards, and consequences. Yet Napoleon fostered a meritocratic environment where talent could flourish, ensuring that fear was balanced by opportunity. This approach strengthened his system, allowing a relatively small number of people to manage vast territories effectively. Napoleon also used psychological insight in his battle strategies. He understood morale, cohesion, and the symbolic weight of victory. Troops who perceived their commander as invincible often fought beyond ordinary limits. Conversely, subtle intimidation could collapse enemy morale before engagement. Napoleon's campaigns were therefore not just tactical exercises, but psychological operations, where perception, narrative, and battlefield action intertwined. Another fascinating fact is Napoleon's attention to timing and rhythm. He coordinated movements to surprise enemies, maintain initiative, and prevent opposition from consolidating. This sensitivity to tempo extended to leadership. He knew when to reward, when to reprimand, and when to intervene personally. Timing, both strategic and psychological, became a tool of power, as potent as artillery. Napoleon's ability to inspire loyalty while managing fear explains the persistence of his influence. Even when facing defeat, desertion, or exile, he maintained authority over ideas, perceptions, and memory. The same traits that won battles, clarity, charisma, calculated coercion, and recognition of merit, enabled him to shape his own legend on St. Helena. Ultimately, this duality illustrates a central truth about Napoleon Bonaparte. His genius was as much psychological as strategic. He understood human nature, manipulated perception, and leveraged both fear and loyalty to achieve his objectives. His effectiveness as a leader was not based solely on intellect or military skill, but on an intricate, deliberate orchestration of human behavior. Napoleon Bonaparte's impact extends far beyond politics, law, or warfare. He became a cultural phenomenon, inspiring artists, writers, and historians for generations. The myths, images, and interpretations of Napoleon reveal as much about society's fascination with power as they do about the man himself. One remarkable fact is Napoleon's deliberate cultivation of his image through art. He commissioned paintings, sculptures, and engravings that emphasized heroism, decisiveness, and authority. Jacques-Louis David's famous painting, Napoleon Crossing the Alps, is emblematic. It portrays him calm, commanding, and larger than life, despite the arduous reality of the crossing. This careful manipulation of visual culture reinforced his myth of invincibility, demonstrating that perception can be as powerful as action. Napoleon also appears extensively in literature. Contemporary writers, both supportive and critical, depicted him as a genius, tyrant, revolutionary, or tragic hero. Tolstoy's War and Peace presents Napoleon as an almost natural force, whose movements are vast and impersonal, contrasting human ambitions with historical inevitability. Romantic poets and novelists, meanwhile, oscillated between admiration and horror, reflecting the contradictory feelings he inspired: awe, fear, envy, and fascination. Another important fact is that myths about Napoleon evolved rapidly after his death. British propaganda emphasized his alleged short stature, cunning, and tyranny, while French Romanticism glorified his ambition, intelligence, and revolutionary ideals. Over time, these opposing narratives fused, creating a complex, multidimensional figure in global consciousness, simultaneously villain and hero, genius and overreacher. The enduring fascination lies in this ambiguity. Napoleon's influence on culture also extended to symbolism. The term Napoleonic became shorthand for ambition, decisiveness, and centralized authority. Military strategies, legal reforms, and bureaucratic innovations were labeled as such, embedding his name in everyday discourse. This demonstrates a rare fact. Few historical figures achieve this level of semantic immortality, where their essence is abstracted into adjective form. Music and theater also engaged with Napoleon. Operas, plays, and musical compositions dramatized his victories, defeats, and personality. These works were not simply entertainment, they interpreted history, reinforced cultural memory, and allowed societies to grapple with his contradictions. Audiences consumed not just his story, but ideas about power, destiny, and human limitation filtered through art. Even monuments and public ceremonies became vehicles for myth-making. His burial in Les Invalides, the grand processions, and later repatriation of his remains all reinforced the narrative of enduring greatness. These symbolic acts ensured that Napoleon was remembered not merely as a man, but as an idea, the embodiment of ambition, genius, and historical inevitability. A revealing fact is that Napoleon's legend continues to evolve. Each generation reinterprets him through its own lens. For some, he represents meritocracy, modernity, and law. For others, he symbolizes authoritarian overreach, imperialism, and war. This flexibility in cultural memory allows him to remain relevant, ensuring that debates about his life, choices, and ethics never fully conclude. Finally, Napoleon's cultural impact demonstrates the inseparability of fact and narrative. His genius, ambition, and failures are intertwined with artistic, literary, and propagandistic representations. The man who died on St. Helena lives in countless paintings, novels, and historical accounts, each shaping the perception of who he was, what he achieved, and what he represents. Napoleon Bonaparte, therefore, is not just history. He is a living cultural symbol. Through art, literature, and memory, his life continues to provoke reflection on power, ambition, and human potential. Napoleon Bonaparte's impact was not confined to Europe. His campaigns, reforms, and the ideological ripple effects of his rule reached far beyond the continent, influencing politics, law, and nationalism worldwide. Understanding these global consequences reveals the breadth of his historical significance. One of the most notable facts is Napoleon's indirect influence on Latin America. The Peninsular War and the invasion of Spain weakened the Spanish crown, creating a power vacuum in its colonies. Revolutionary movements in countries like Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, and Mexico gained momentum, inspired partly by the political destabilization Napoleon caused. Leaders like Simón Bolívar benefited from the conditions Napoleon set in motion, demonstrating how his actions reshaped the colonial world even without directly conquering it. Napoleon's legal reforms also traveled globally. The Napoleonic Code was introduced in parts of Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and parts of Germany, and later influenced civil law systems in Latin America by standardizing legal principles, emphasizing equality before the law, and establishing merit-based civil administration. These reforms provided frameworks that persist today. Even territories not directly under French control absorbed aspects of his legal philosophy, underscoring his long-term global influence. In the Middle East and Egypt, Napoleon's campaigns, particularly the Egyptian expedition of 1798, combined military conquest with scientific exploration. While the military objectives were limited, the scholarly missions accompanying the campaigns produced extensive studies in archaeology, natural history, and cartography. The Description de l'Égypte documented Egyptian culture and infrastructure in unprecedented detail, introducing Europe to new knowledge and indirectly inspiring future colonial and scientific endeavors. Another revealing fact is that Napoleon's global impact extended through ideas as well as institutions. His emphasis on centralized governance, secular law, and rational administration provided a model for leaders seeking to modernize states outside Europe. Reformers in the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, and the Americas studied his methods for inspiration, applying them selectively to local conditions. Napoleon's influence was therefore both practical, through law, education, and bureaucracy, and conceptual, shaping notions of modern statecraft. Napoleon also contributed to the spread of nationalism beyond Europe. His conquests and restructuring of territories prompted resistance movements worldwide. Occupied peoples, whether in Spain, Germany, or Italy, were forced to confront questions of identity, sovereignty, and self-determination. These reactions laid the groundwork for nationalist movements globally, highlighting how one individual's ambition can provoke ideological shifts far from home. Economically, Napoleon's continental system, designed to blockade Britain, had unintended global effects. Trade restrictions, disruptions, and market realignments forced nations to innovate, find alternatives, and adapt to shifting power structures. While aimed at Europe, these economic ripples affected international trade networks, including the Americas and colonies dependent on European markets. Finally, Napoleon's campaigns demonstrated the global interconnectivity of military, political, and cultural influence. He showed that a powerful leader could reshape not only local conditions, but also the broader geopolitical landscape. His strategies, reforms, and ideas were observed, adapted, resisted, and debated around the world, cementing his status as a figure of global historical significance. Napoleon Bonaparte was thus more than a European emperor. He was a catalyst for worldwide transformation. His military, legal, and ideological innovations reshaped continents, inspired revolutions, and altered perceptions of governance, law, and leadership far beyond France. His reach, intentional or not, extended to every corner where ideas, institutions, and ambition intersected. Napoleon Bonaparte's life is a story of extraordinary genius, relentless ambition, and profound contradiction. From his rise as a young artillery officer to his ultimate exile on St. Helena, he reshaped Europe, influenced the world, and left a legacy that continues to fascinate scholars, leaders, and the public alike. One fundamental fact is that Napoleon embodied both creation and destruction. He toppled old regimes, redrew borders, and centralized power. Yet he also built lasting institutions, legal systems, educational frameworks, and bureaucracies that endure centuries later. This duality illustrates the complexity of his impact. He was a force of both upheaval and organization, a man capable of rewriting society while imposing structure upon it. Napoleon's ambition was boundless, yet deeply human. Driven by insecurity from childhood, he sought recognition, authority, and a place in history. His desire for greatness was personal, psychological, and political simultaneously. This ambition propelled him to victories unmatched in scale, but it also set the stage for overreach and eventual downfall. His story reminds us that genius alone is insufficient without awareness of limits, context, and the forces beyond one's control. Another enduring fact is his mastery of perception. Napoleon understood that power is as much about belief as it is about reality. Through art, propaganda, leadership, and carefully crafted personal narratives, he shaped how contemporaries and future generations viewed him. Even in defeat, he controlled the narrative, ensuring that memory and legacy remained under his influence. He was as much an architect of his legend as he was of Europe. Napoleon also personifies the tension between innovation and authoritarianism. He promoted meritocracy, standardized law, and secular governance, advancing modernity in revolutionary ways. Yet he centralized power, censored dissent, and imposed control with a firm hand. This tension makes him relevant to contemporary discussions about leadership, governance, and the balance between freedom and order. His life provides both inspiration and caution. His personal traits, discipline, intelligence, charisma, strategic foresight, enabled extraordinary accomplishments. His quirks, superstitions, and human vulnerabilities remind us that even the greatest figures are shaped by ordinary experiences, emotions, and limitations. Understanding these dimensions allows us to see Napoleon not merely as a symbol, but as a human being navigating the complex interplay of opportunity, ambition, and historical circumstance. Napoleon's global influence reinforces another critical fact. History is interconnected. His actions in Europe prompted revolutions in Latin America, inspired legal reforms across continents, and shaped ideas about nationalism, military strategy, and governance worldwide. His legacy cannot be confined to a single region or era. It is a thread woven into the modern world. Finally, the fascination with Napoleon persists because he represents extremes: genius and hubris, order and chaos, inspiration and terror. He challenges us to consider the potentials and limits of human achievement. His life illustrates that greatness is rarely simple or unambiguous. It is a mixture of brilliance, ambition, circumstance, and the ever-present possibility of failure. Napoleon Bonaparte remains one of history's most compelling figures because he embodies the human struggle to balance ambition with responsibility, innovation with restraint, and power with legacy. He transformed his world, left systems and ideas that endure, and continues to teach lessons about leadership, strategy, and the nature of history itself. In the end, Napoleon's story is not just about battles won or lost, or empires built and destroyed. It is about the extraordinary complexity of one individual's impact on the world, and how ambition, intelligence, and vision can leave an imprint far larger than life itself. His life challenges us to reflect, to question, and to understand the intricate dance between human potential and human limitation, a dance that continues to captivate the imagination of every generation.